Hello, everybody. My name is Chance, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Dole Institute. First and foremost, welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program. It's presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you about today's program. Please let us know if you have any feedback by contacting us on social media or via email at doleinstitute@ku.edu. We have a great slate of programs covering both current events and historical topics this summer, including our summer discussion groups and on issues and opportunities related to the U.S.-Mexico border. You can find upcoming events on your program handout today or grab a flyer listing all of our July events on the table outside. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon as well. We would like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive research and our student activities. Please contact us if you're interested. After the presentation, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones and that our next Leavenworth lecture is going to be on August 3rd at 3 p.m. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dave Cotter, the Deputy Director of the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Girgis. And he wrote this great thing up for me, but I don't need that. Professor Girgis is one of the most outstanding members of the history faculty at the Command and General Staff College. In the largest military history department in the United States, he is our Napoleonic expert. Students line up to take his courses. Remarkable scholar, great leader, over 20 years as a U.S. Army officer, armor officer, served in Desert Storm as a company commander in a M1 Abrams company, and then came back and went to the Florida State University and studied Napoleonic history under Dr. Donald Horwood there. He's an author of a number of different chapters in a number of different books, all of which are related to Napoleon. This is another one of the episodes in this series that we have with the Dole Center that we really are proud to be part of. And so, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Girgis.
Wow, nothing makes you feel better than having to bring more chairs in as you come, so thank you. This week, I have a couple of disclaimers, and one part is the title. It's slightly different than the title on there. I've been working with and playing with the title, because I don't like it. It really should be The Rise of Napoleon and then The Rise of Everybody Else. So I think it's less about the decline of Napoleon, everybody else getting better. And that's what we're going to really talk about today. And I should point out this particular illustration up here. This is a German illustration from 1814 or 1815 that shows the life of Napoleon and shows his different stages, as the course continued, as a general, as a man of state, then as a grand man of state, as it's translated from the German, then in Spain, in Russia, being kicked out of Germany. We'll talk about that in a little bit. What's cut off here is showing the gallows there, and then if you look closely, he's got two devils down there with their pitchforks poking in hell underneath. And Napoleon is not going to be necessarily the main focus for today. He's going to play a key role. He is, as Stendhal said, a great bad man, and you can't talk about this era without talking about him. But before we get started really on this, I want to kind of put a little bit of context of what this Dole Institute's series that we've been doing over the last few months are, and talk about how this fits into what we do. And at Fort Leavenworth, we have about 1,300 Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine officers who come in. They spend 10 months here. And as part of that, they get about 60 hours of history class without the electives. Every single student gets that. It's broken down into 3 blocks, an H100, which is what we call the Rise of the Western Way of War, which looks at from the 30 Years' War up until 1918. H200, which is military innovation in peace and war, it looks at the period between World War I and World War II and how organizations dealt with new change, new technologies, and then how their performance was in the Second World War. And then the last one is H300, the roots of the operational environment, that really focus our officers on what the world's like that they're going out to and how theoretically it's been created. Today we're going to focus on this H100, Rise of the Western Way of War, and what we're going to talk about is really two lessons that we do here. And one of the structures that we use is this idea of a military revolution. This comes from a historian, Michael Roberts, who in 1955 does a lecture, and he talks about Gustavus Adolphus in Sweden in the 16th century and this creation of a modern state, and how when Gustavus creates this modern state with a bureaucracy, and he's able to kind of squeeze the land a little bit more efficiency, and with all these changes going on there, creates what they call a military revolution. And these are, as you can see, there's only been 5 in the last 350 years. They're big. They're seismic changes. We talk about them like an earthquake. And it has a couple of features to it. One is that whoever's the paradigm army, the best army, the one that epitomizes that age, after that military revolution, probably isn't the paradigm army. The second aspect of it is it's not predictable, it's not foreseeable, and it's not controllable. Like an earthquake, you just hang on and hope that you can survive it. And I'll come back to why we talk about this with our officers, but the period here in the rise and fall of Napoleon really talks about that rise of nationalism in the nation state, the French Revolution. And we're going to talk a little bit about the intellectual fervent that's going on in the 18th century prior to the revolution, and how the revolution kind of unleashes all the bounds and allows these things to come about. I already talked about Gustavus. When we talk about the modern state and this creation of a bureaucracy, one of the illustrations we use is Frederick the Great in Prussia. Of the 5 great powers in Europe, Prussia is the smallest, only about 9 million people in the 1750s. But Frederick's father and then Frederick are able to create this really, really efficient model that allows them to basically fight at a much higher level than their size would allow them to do. How does he do this? Well, he does it by discipline, and it's this age of limited warfare. And when I say limited warfare, I'm not talking about limiting the cost. It's not bloodless by any stretch of the imagination. There's lots of battles and cost that way. But what they try to do is limit the effect on society, and they do that by taking soldiers, making armies as separate from society as they possibly can. So to create these soldiers, I think it takes 2 years to create a disciplined soldier to be able to stand in these serried ranks and fire. And part of that is because of the muzzle loaders, the smoothbore muskets that are very, very inaccurate. You have to stand almost shoulder to shoulder and fire at relatively short ranges compared to today's weapons, and take it. It's counter-instinctual. You don't want to do that, but yet you have to. And so they said it takes 2 years to do it. The other aspect is Prussia doesn't have a big population, so where do you get your soldiers from? If you take it from your hardworking city people or farmers, that's going to hurt your own society. So instead, you impress deserters from other armies. You take prisoners of war and you make them into Prussian soldiers. You take the drunks, the ill-to-wells, the people who commit crimes, and you put them in the army. Now, they don't want to be there. So how do you keep them there? You keep them there through fear. And you keep them there through absolutely harsh discipline. One of the things the Prussian army has is the gauntlet, where they basically line up all the non-commissioned officers and officers of a regiment, and the soldier would walk in the middle, no shirt on, and they would whack him in the back with these birch swigs, trying to cut and open the back. Executions, they would ride, mutilations, tattooing, all these different very, very harsh punishments. And one of the things Frederick the Great and the Prussian army really says is we want the soldiers to fear their own officers more than the enemy. Because if they're marching forward and you have to fight, and you stop, like you're even going to start to think about running, you know you're going to get killed by a non-commissioned officer or an officer behind you. So your chances are better by fighting the enemy. What does that allow them to do? Well, it allows Prussia, starting in 1740, to fight 2 different wars where they pretty much fight all of Europe. Prussia, 9 million people are there, surrounded by 20 million Russians, 18 to 20 million Austrians, and 20 million Frenchmen. And they're gonna fight all through those. And so what'll end up happening, they'll fight an eight years war, the War of Austrian Succession. They'll have an 8-year break where everyone kind of rearms, refuels, and changes some diplomatic pieces, and then they'll fight a 7 years war. And Prussia, at the end of that, has been saved by its army. The picture up there on the 1st Guards Battalion at Cologne, if you look very closely at that, that is a rearguard action. Frederick the Great loses. But this shows his guards, and it shows how good their discipline is. If you look, there's 3 ranks of soldiers firing. The first 2 ranks are firing to your left at the enemy. They've taken the other rank, and they've done it about face, and that rank is firing to your right at the other enemy. Technically, that's surrounded, and yet these guys are firing in both directions and being fired on, and they're going to provide the rear guard and allow Frederick's army to get away. That's the kind of discipline now that the Prussian army is trying to do. It has, of course, some real disadvantages. When Frederick goes out to the field with the Prussian army, he can't camp near woods because his soldiers will try to sneak away. He has a hard time with his cavalry operations because his cavalry, instead of being the eyes and ears of the army out trying to find the enemy, most of the time is spending their time around his army, more of a cordon to keep his soldiers in. If you send soldiers out to get water, for example, you can't just send a bunch of soldiers and one non-commissioned officer out to go fill canteens. You've got to send a bunch of non-commissioned officers out with there because the soldiers may rush. So those kind of disadvantages have tactical implications for him. The other thing is you have to keep them fed and you have to keep them supplied. If you don't feed them, the army disappears. The soldiers will start to run away. So you have to be very, very careful on making sure your lines of communication, also the magazines or fortresses have to be used as points to supply your troops. And so all these wagons, all this extra supply slows down the movement of the army. So I want you to keep that in mind because that's really the epitome of what's going on as we look at the 1700s to the late, getting up to the French Revolution. Now, while this warfare is going on, of course, there's a number of other things. And intellectually, we're not going to talk too much about this slide. You probably are pretty familiar with most of these ideas, but there's this intellectual movement called the Enlightenment. And the French philosophes, I have a picture of a couple of them up there, are talking about things like this idea, tabula rasa, the Latin word for blank slate, that you're not born into a certain position, that you start with a blank slate, and by your talent, by your abilities, you can rise up anywhere you are. Sounds great for us. For a autocratic ruler in the 17th or 18th century who's king because God made him king, and you're a noble because God made you a nobleman, and a peasant certainly can never become a nobleman. This is a really very unsettling type of idea, that person by their own hard work and their own abilities could rise up to whatever level they want. It also talks about where do you get national rights? These unalienable rights they talk about as part of what comes. And the other aspect is this idea of a social contract, right? That the government, you give up certain rights to the government gives up certain things to protect you. And once that bonds have been broken, that you have the right first to revolt and then revolution. Should all sound familiar, particularly this week after the 4th of July from our Declaration of Independence. So this is what's going on, and this really comes from the scientific revolution that started the century before. If you think back to a person like Isaac Newton, who comes up with gravity. If before Isaac Newton, if you saw an apple fall, why did it fall? Because God willed it to fall, right? Not because there's gravity and there's unwritten laws and all these things. And so when Newton starts to look at this and says, well, there's rules that are governing us. I can measure this, I can figure out why and how fast this apple's gonna fall. When Halley predicts when a comet is gonna come back, all these type of things start saying that these unobservable things, if I have the right mathematics, if I have the right tool, I can start to predict and look at this. And so these guys, using that rational thought and empirical data, try to figure out the rules that are governing society and how government and the governed fit together. There's a similar thing going on with the military. And if you look and think back to this time period, this is a time to purchase system, and it's nothing to have a 8-year-old colonel of a regiment because he's aristocratic, his father has money, has bought him a regiment. The regiment is organized, has the number of people and how they fight based on the whim of that commander. And so you can't put this regiment, say, let's just say 1,000 people, you can't put that together with a bigger organization and be able to fight effectively if everyone has different tactics, different ways of marching, different ways of moving. What really caused the impetus for all these military thought is the poor performance of the French forces during the 7 Years' War. And so there are going to be a number of military commissions that are going to start looking at different things. There's also guys like General de Broglie down there who during the 7 Years' War is going to do some experiments. At that time period, an army basically was one big element. They called it a unitarian army, where the only way it fights is as a big thing. It comes to a field, it deploys, it might take it half a day to get out there, and then it fights the other army. And de Broglie experiments with things of taking this big army and dividing them up into smaller elements. All these elements would have different portions. They'd have infantry with it, cavalry with it, artillery with it, engineers. And so these different elements could on their own fight together. The problem is, of course, is that guys like Broglie who are doing some very, very innovative things, it's all personality driven. And there's no systemization of this within France. The big two people here to remember is Guibert and Bourset. Guibert of the two is the more important one. He's going to write the essay, general essay on tactics, and he's going to talk about what if we had these motivated soldiers that aren't motivated by fear, but instead for love of country. What if instead of just trying to shoo the enemy off without a big battle, that instead we look for a decisive battle, trying to destroy the enemy army. He's also going to talk about dividing up the army, making a standardization of the different size units. Bourset, he's going to publish an essay on the principles of mountain warfare. His is not going to be published, but it'll be published generally, but it's available, and there are copies out among the army. And what the principles of mountain warfare talk about, it's done like a war gamer, where he looks at terrain where you can't move an army on one road. And so he has to break up this army on multiple routes. And each of these routes has to have some infantry, some cavalry, some artillery. He calls them this mini armies or divisions. And they move on multiple routes, and then they come together at once to be able to fight in time and space. And you start looking at this and you're seeing all this fervor. The problem is, of course, is that all this can't go into effect as long as you have the existing system. If you're an aristocratic officer in the army, you don't want a lot of these things because this is the way we've always done it. Why should I change? What's the real purpose for me doing it? The order mixed, immense, and profound. And there's a big argument in the late 18th century about the order, how you deploy your soldiers. Mostly what Frederick the Great does is deploy in line. That's the French for mince. And they will fight two linear battles fighting against each other. And there are people who talk about, well, we're going to do it in column instead. Instead of being in long line of 3 deep, we'll be in a column, 30 wide, 60 deep. And this moves quicker, and it also they talk about the natural elan of the French soldiers, so that you can move around the battlefield much more quickly, and it takes into account their national pride. And so all these questions are out there and not really settled. And then there'll be one big event that kind of clears the table and allows people to try anything they can. And that, of course, is the revolution. And I'll come back to the 1791 regulations, because all these ideas are out there, and they're going to write in 1791 the regulations for the army. Those regulations are before the war start. They don't start until 1792. And those regulations will be in effect till 1830. So all what is used in the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era is regulations that are written prior to the warfare starting. So what allows change to start? Well, the revolution starts, of course. You get the king being limited in his ability first of moving around. The Women's March are going to bring the king from Versailles back to Paris and make him a virtual prisoner in Paris. Then when they find out about him committing treason, trying to deal with other monarchs, they first are going to depose him and declare a republic. And then in January 1793, they'll execute him. At that point, the French government can't go back. If you voted for the death of the king, you can't negotiate with the other kings, okay? You are a threat to all of Europe. And starting as early as April, warfare is going to start, and it's going to continue building until by January 1793, they're at war with all of Europe. Remember, there's two republics in the world in 1793, us and them, and the French, okay? And so France, with 30 million Frenchmen in the middle of Europe, is a huge threat, and the other countries can't let this go. The other one I didn't put up here is on the 4th of August, 1789, is a huge day in France. They have had the Bastille Day. They've created this National Assembly. And on the 4th of August, they are going to get up, and one after another, they are going to give up their feudal privileges. And so overnight in France, the aristocracy disappears and gives up and says, we're all citizens, we all have the same rights and privileges. It's a huge day. It really levels out the field. It also starts what they call the émigrés, where you start getting aristocrats who don't agree with that, who start seeing the handwriting on the wall and start to flee France. How big a deal is this? Well, prior to the revolution, there's about 18,000 army officers. Clausel's trying to get rid of a lot of these officers who really don't have positions. He tries to get them down to 9,000. When you look at those 9,000 officers, out of those 9,000, 90% are aristocrat. Now, when you take that over the French population of 30 million, the aristocracy is about 300,000 people. So it's a very, very small portion of the French thing. So something like 28.5% of the French population, or excuse me, 28.5% of the million people are not able to fill the majority of those officer positions. Once the immigration starts, and once the revolution starts getting more and more violent, those aristocratic officers are going to leave. By 1794, 3% of the army is aristocrat. 97% have come from that middle class and lower class and have risen up. What does it do? Well, one, it makes the army officers much, much younger, much more, have more energy, more vitality. I always tell my students when we talk, you don't hear lieutenants ever saying, we don't do things that way. You tell a lieutenant to do something, it's usually, okay, I'll try it. And they'll try it no matter how ridiculous it is. When you suddenly have 9,000 brand new officers, and what they've lost is really all the upper echelon of officers, they're willing to try anything. If it works, it's good. It doesn't matter what tradition and custom goes by. I want to point this out. This is a huge, it's not really a battle. It's a cannonade is what they call it. The Prussians are invading France. They're heading to Paris. And on the 20th of September, they get to a town called Valmy. And they are going to stop their march to fight this revolutionary army. And the revolutionary army is going to have cannons. The Prussians are going to have cannons. They're going to spend the day firing cannons at each other. The Prussian commander, the Duke of Brunswick, sees the revolutionary army standing there willing to fight. And he says it's not really worth it to continue to advance, and he is going to pull his Prussian forces back out. And it saves the revolution at that point. And it's also the last time we really see the Prussian army in the war for about a 16-year period. Because after this time, what France is going to be fighting is the Austrians, the Russians, Piedmontese, all these other states, but not the Prussians. And we'll come back to them and why that's important. So let's talk a little bit about some of the changes that are going on in the Army and what happens to the Army. And at first, that revolution, making war with all of Europe. So now you suddenly have about 180,000 man army, and you're being invaded and fighting every single army in Europe. Plus, you don't trust the old army, and you have a lot of these officers. So one of the things that's going to be done is this thing called the levée en masse, where Frederick the Great tried to limit the impact of war on his citizens as much as possible and take in really the outsiders and the useless ones and make them into good soldiers. The French take a different approach. All Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for army service. Young men will go to fight. The married men will forge arms and carry supplies. The men will make tents and uniforms and serve in the hospitals. The children will shred old clothes. The old men will take to the public squares to excite the courage of the combatants, the hatred of royalty, and unity of the republic. Challenge you to find someone in French society who's left out of that. The entire society is at war. Everybody. We have got this experiment, liberty, equality, and fraternity. We have got to protect it. and every single person now has to do that. Does a couple of things. Okay, so now you have motivation. You're not staying there because of fear. Can you camp near woods? Sure. People are going to come because they know they're trying to save France. Can you move quickly? Do you need huge wagon trains? No. One of the other things, so the Army goes from about 180,000 to anywhere up to about 1.2 to 1.5 million. They're not 100% sure. A lot of problems with just the record keeping at this time, a lot of desertions later on. But the armies get huge. The other thing is you don't worry so much about casualties. When you're Frederick the Great or any of these ancien regime armies, casualties take you 2 years to replace. You don't have 2 years to replace it. These literally are talking about taking soldiers, many times they're handing them pikes, not even muskets. You don't even have to train them how to shoot. Here's a pike, move to the front, and you're gonna learn as you go. So replacements, taking casualties, suffering casualties aren't such a big deal. Officer vacancies. Suddenly you have this huge pool of people who you can promote based on their performance. And if they don't do well, you fire them. Now, there's about 60 general officers during this time period who don't do well, and when I say fire, they guillotine them. That's not necessarily what I mean, but you can take these officers up, they don't do well, or they rise up to a certain level and you leave them at that level. But it allows you to try people, and if you're really good, you can keep rising up, like some young Corsican we'll talk about in a few moments. Logistics problems. The society, and when you pull up the entire society to go to war, pretty much the economy shuts down. All these type of just normal logistics, we talk, food, ammunition, all that kind of stuff stops. But that's okay, because you don't have to have these huge wagon trains anymore. By making officers who aren't aristocratic, you now also can have a lot smaller wagon trains. My area I study and do a lot of research in is the Peninsula War under the Duke of Wellington and the British. A typical British cavalry officer, a young lieutenant, arrives in Lisbon. He gets from his regiment a batman who's just an enlisted soldier with his horse. So the officer usually brings 2, maybe 3 horses of his own. Then he has his batman who has a horse. Then he'll hire a cook who usually has a mule. And then he'll have another servant who has a mule. Then he has another pack mule they have a pannier of pots and pans and that kind of stuff, and that might be 1 or 2 mules. And so this one lieutenant might have 8 animals with him and 5 people. And all that does is congest the road. It just makes it more and more stuff on these roads as you try to move. And by having officers who live the same way the soldiers do, eat the same way the soldiers do, you have a lot less of just stuff on the road to be able to congest it. So the armies start to move much more rapidly. Typical French army at this time period, when you look at like the 1805 campaign, on a daily basis does about 28 miles. And the US Army after World War I is trying to study the 1805 Army, trying to figure out how to speed up our army to march that far, where a typical Austrian or Russian army in the same campaign does 11 miles. So you're doing almost 3 times faster. So if you think about that from trying to do something on the battlefield, the French can react, if they know what's going on, about 3 times faster than an Austrian or Russian army. Control problems. These officers, even though you have this motivation, you have some really, really good, don't have the skill set that you had with these older officers. And so you start to make these organizational changes. One of the things they're going to do is this idea of the division. And it's where we get the term division today, but they've made these all-arms teams where you have cavalry, infantry, artillery, engineers, all the different component parts, but you also have a staff. And the important part of the staff is they habitually are talking about and doing the orders on routes, where you're going to stop, how you're going to deploy, how you're going to get fed. And so by having this habitually being done, you start to have a more articulated type army. The other aspect it does is by having more of this articulation going on, it allows the army to become more robust. If you destroy a single brigade, the army doesn't fall apart. As you have all these different plug-and-play type of units, it stays, it takes the fight much more effectively. And then the tactical changes. You have lots of infantrymen who've come, they have tons of motivation, but they don't have the discipline. So you can't stand in these long lines like Frederick the Great and fire. So let's use this column to move them around the battlefield. And what they find out, what initially is a means to move them around the battlefield, you now have this capability of moving very, very rapidly and having shock effect. You can use that formation to hit someone, or you can deploy in line and fire on it. And so you have the ability of both shock and firepower to use in the organization. And these things are by 1793, 94 starting to percolate in there, and by the late 1790s, they have become systematized within the French army. And you see, I have there, add an ambitious and capable leader, we'll come back to him. This system starts to become this really incredibly vibrant, quick-moving, seeking decisive action. Your unlimited aims. You go to the jugular. You want to destroy the enemy army. You're not just trying to get them out of France because they're trying to kill you and they're going to hang you or guillotine you for killing the king. So you seek for decisive battle. When you add all those things together, this army becomes very, very good. And I want to point out, when you start looking at this, Napoleon is not the only successful French revolutionary general. 1799, 18th Brumaire, Napoleon will be part of a coup that takes power and becomes a consul. But there are a number of other general officers at that time that they're thinking about trying to get into this coup because they're as successful. Napoleon's better than everybody else. He'll really show that with his administrative skills. But he's not the only successful officer in there. Why? Well, the speed that they move their armies, the flexibility, the ability to seek decisive battle, and even if you get beat, the resiliency of that army, the quality of these officers who have risen up, who are young, enthusiastic, all these things make the French, and you can see the map there, just how much the French Republic expands between 1793 and 1800. Now, if you want to ever get a chance, we're not going to talk about this because unfortunately we don't have that much time. The 1796-97 campaign shows Napoleon at his absolutely greatest. He is going to leave the Maritime Alps, defeat Piedmont, push Austria out of northern Italy, and then move towards a march on Vienna until he actually gets a peace treaty. It shows him moving rapidly, small numbers, threatening lines of communications, going around the rear of the enemy, hitting them where they're not expecting it again and again and again. It's an absolute brilliant campaign. And I should mention up there, if you notice, it has first coalition, because we're going to talk a little bit about the various coalitions. So the second, third coalitions, unfortunately, this one slide will be your entire piece because we're going to jump over some of Napoleon's greatest campaigns. The Battle of the Pyramids in Egypt, where he's there, soldiers, 40 centuries of history looks down on you. And 3 divisions will attack and push the Mamluks back into the Nile. Battle of Marengo in 1800, where if you like chicken Marengo, that's where it comes from, 14th of June, the evening of the battle. But defeats the Austrians after the Austrian commander thinks they've beaten the French. It's late in the day, about 5 o'clock. The Austrian commander has actually left the battlefield to go back to write a report to Vienna saying, we've beaten the French. Napoleon gets one more division, comes marching up to the sound of the guns, they counterattack and win. And then probably his greatest set-piece battle, Austerlitz, the Battle of the Three Emperors, where Napoleon defeats the Austrian Emperor and the Russian Emperor, destroys the Austrian army, knocks them out of the war, destroys the main Russian army. I'm going to jump right ahead into the War of the Fourth Coalition, which at this point is the Russians who are licking their wounds and trying to create a new army in 1806, and the Prussians, who in the summer of 1806 begin to prep to go to war. And everyone in Europe is saying, good, finally. The French have been beaten up on the JVs. They have been fighting the second-tier armies. Now we're going to get the army of Frederick the Great. Now, Frederick's been dead for 15 years, 16 years now. They haven't fought the Prussians for 14 years. So think about from 2017, it's not that far ago, 14 years. So the idea that this is still the army of Frederick the Great, this is still the best army in Europe, that it is going to show and put the French in its place, really show Napoleon how it's going to be done. You see the one image there, that is the Prussian Guards throughout the summer of 1806. They go to the French embassy and they sharpen their sabers on the front steps of the French embassy. Just kind of a little bit of just showing the French their disdain of what they're going to do. When war comes, the Prussians don't act logically. The Prussians think that they may attack and try to do a spoiling attack against Napoleon, and then in 1807 do the big campaign when the Russians get there. Napoleon, of course, isn't going to wait. And he creates this organization called the Battalion Square. It's the Battalion Square. I should mention, Napoleon invents, if you want to say tactically, he wants, or organizationally, he invents one thing. He invents the Corps. He takes the division that is that's being done by the French Revolutionary armies and puts a couple of divisions together with a marshal, a staff, and that ends up being a corps. And in this particular one, this Battalion Square is still a tactic we use today. If you look at the U.S. Army going out to the National Training Center out in California, if we don't know what the enemy's going to do and our intelligence is poor, we deploy in a battalion square, a tank battalion. And it has its reconnaissance out in the front and the sides. You usually have some sort of advance guard, and then you have your reserve. And the idea being is wherever you make contact, you can react. So if you're going forward and you hit the enemy, whoever hits it first fixes the enemy, and then the other units come around to the flank and side and try to envelop it. If you hit them on the side, and your cavalry tells you hit them over here, these units would fix, and then these units would come around and do an envelopment. And so Napoleon, not understanding what the Prussians are going to do, is going to move into Prussian territory using this battalion carré. The Prussians at this time are also trying to do their initial plan of doing a spoiling attack against Napoleon, and they're going to be moving south near the town of Jena and Auerstadt. They're going to get down here, they're going to stop. They have another advanced guard that's down here in the 3rd Gen Force that'll be destroyed by the French. About the time they start to figure out where the French are, they stop, and they're going to start to move back as Napoleon and his army is moving up. And they're going to make contact. And the battalion carré is going to work exactly the way it's designed. They do basically a big left flank. The corps here run into the Prussian advance guard under the direct command of Napoleon. This corps under a guy named Davout, I have a friend who's the head of the history department at West Point who loves Davout because Davout's balding and has spectacles. He's a short guy, and he says that's the epitome of a real warrior, the guy with his spectacles. I see some of them. You like that description, don't you? Yeah, exactly. But Davout is probably the best corps commander in the Grand Army. Davout's three divisions, are going to turn and attack the Prussian main body. He is outnumbered 3-1 in infantry. Does anyone want to guess how this battle goes for the French? He's going to win. He is going to continue to advance, and he is going to destroy the Prussian main body. He suffers 25% casualties in his corps. It is a very, very costly. But that night, he is writing back to Napoleon saying, hey, boss, I just defeated the Prussian main guard. Napoleon thinks he has defeated the main body of the Prussians, and that's where that quote is, tell your marshal he is seeing double, making fun of his glasses. No, he isn't seeing double. And if you think about it, the main French army has destroyed the advance guard, but a single corps has destroyed it. And then he lets loose the cavalry. In a 33-day pursuit, the French cavalry and the 1st Corps of Bernadotte, who purposely, I have this here, he doesn't get involved in either fight that day. He kind of wanders around, and he almost gets fired. Napoleon decides to keep him. They're going to destroy the Prussian army. 140,000 prisoners, 25 stands of colors. So we're talking the Prussian national flag and the regimental flags, and 2,000 cannons. The Prussian army ceases to exist in the month of October of 1806. This is the same Prussian army that for 15 years fought all of Europe. And now in a single afternoon and then a pursuit afterwards is destroyed. Europe is absolutely stunned. And this shows really the epitome of how good this French system is. because of all the battles that we've talked about so far, this is the one that Napoleon probably does the worst in. He doesn't give 2 of his corps any orders that day. He loses a corps that kind of wanders around. He thinks he's fighting the main guard. He doesn't have a good picture. This is really his subordinate commanders in the strength of the French army. And they are the ones who win the battle for him that day. And they do it against the Prussian army. It's an absolutely astounding victory. So how do you start to match what the French have done? And this is what a number of these armies are going to do, is they're starting to look at how can we make these reforms, because we see this absolutely incredible system that the French have. The problem is, of course, if you're a monarch like the Austrian emperor, you can't go too far, because too far, of course, was my cousin getting his head cut off and the end of the monarchy. So you have to try to figure out what things you can do and what things you can't. The Prussians are going to go up to Memel on the Baltic, and it's about as far away from France and the French army as you can get. And they are going to have a military commission that's going to go there. Napoleon's going to say, what is going on in Memel seems like a bad joke. And they're going to say, and there's some little names in Prussian military history, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, one of the chief of staff, one of the subordinate officers there is a guy named Clausewitz. They're up there, and they're trying to figure out how do we confront the French. And one of the things that's going to come out, there's also civil reforms by Hardenberg and the Prussian ministers, is they're going to come out, and the first reform edict says, we abolish serfdom. Wait a second, that's not reforming the army, but they abolish serfdom. They make the restrictions off of nobility, where your only job isn't to be in the officer corps. So now anyone can be in the officer corps. They start making administrative restrictions. They start to say, okay, we're trying to make these citizens of Prussia not subjects that we're going to do the harsh punishments. So they loosen the punishments. And so they're going to have about a 5-year period of trying to do this. When they go back and fight the French for the first time in 1813, they're going to fight for a day at Gros Baron, and Napoleon's comment at the end of the day is, the beasts have learned something. It's an interesting comment. The beasts have learned something. There's a lot of disdain in that, the beasts. But at the same point, there's a grudging respect that they've gotten better. And they're not the only army that is doing these reforms and trying to see what is making the French so good. We're finally up to the 6th coalition, 6th of 7, and we're not going to get into the 7 because that's Waterloo. 1813, 1814. I need to back up too for a second, because if you think about the 6th coalition, warfare against the French and the Russians start in June of 1812 and go all the way to April 1814. So we're talking a 2.5-year period of warfare, or 2-year period of warfare, and there's going to be some constant periods of it. We're starting to go away from battle and starting to get into campaigns. It's a much more modern way of warfare, where you're seeing series of battles, and the sizes of the army start to grow. Napoleon does an absolutely amazing thing. He loses an army in Russia, rushes back to Paris, comes back with something like 60,000 soldiers after going into Russia with about 600,000. And in about a 4-month period, will build a new grand army and take the field in May of 1813. In the first 2 battles, he wins. He doesn't have the ability to destroy those other armies, but it absolutely stuns the Allies. And it's going to start to change the dynamic of the war. One thing is, this war becomes not just a war against Napoleon, it becomes a war against, it's a nationalistic war. It's to liberate the German peoples from this French influence. That's an interesting piece, because if you think about Germany at this time, it's 37 different states. It's not just Prussia and Austria, but it's 37 different kingdoms and principalities. There's also been the Peninsula War. For the last 6 years, Napoleon has been fighting. His brother has been the king in Spain against the British army, Portuguese, and Spanish army. The army that fights at Jena Auerstadt in 1806 is the one that goes to the peninsula and is going to be stuck there for the next 6 or 7 years. So this army that goes into Russia is a different army. It's not the same Grand Army that had been trained for years up on the Channel Coast. And the quality starts to go down. He has to call up the reserves, not just the class year of 1813. When he's in Russia in 1812, he calls up the class of 1813. So he's starting to get younger and younger recruits. They call them Maria Luisas because the queen is very, very young, and these recruits are very, very young. To augment these infantrymen that aren't doing as well on individual basis, he has to start putting more and more artillery out there on the field. The Army in 1813 has about 560 cannons with it. And typically a cannon dragged by 8 horses, and then it has a couple of other caissons and stuff with it. When he's in northern Italy in 1796, his army had 80 cannons. So you can just see how he's augmenting the decline of his infantry, but it also has other effects too. They can't move as quickly. They can't do these sweeping, bold movements as rapidly because of the road congestion. They're also fighting in Silesia, again and again, fighting in Saxony over and over. And so basically the area is becoming denuded of food. So you have to rely more on logistics. You have to store it. And all this is taking away his ability to fight. The other issue is Allied motivation. I have up there on the upper right corner, of course, the burning of Moscow. Napoleon doesn't burn it, the Russians burn it themselves, but that takes a lot of hatred. And of course, they want to get to Paris. They want to do the same type of thing. So they're in it for the long haul. And they're going to come up with the Trachenberg Protocol and Reichenberg Plan. And it's pretty simple. First off, don't fight where Napoleon is. Napoleon's got 3 armies. We have 3 armies. Wherever Napoleon is, avoid battle and retreat. Pull him in and allow our other armies to defeat his marshals and generals. Wear him out as much as possible. And they're going to do that throughout the fall of 1813, finally to Leipzig, where they'll have the Battle of Nations, and Napoleon will have to give up Germany. The other aspect they do, which is pretty smart, is the 3 Allied armies are not national armies. There's not an Austrian army, a Prussian army, and a Swedish army, and a Russian army. Every one of the armies has every nationality in it. So the main army under General Schwarzenberg in the center, 200,000 men made up of Austrians, Russians, and Prussians. Army of the North under Bernadotte, who's now the King of Sweden, is made up of Swedes, North Germans, Prussians. And all that's done is so that Napoleon can't destroy one army and knock a country out of the war. Every army has got elements of the other ones. So let's talk a little bit about the reasons for his decline, or, as I probably should have put, the reasons for everybody else getting better. The Allies learned from defeats. They are getting beaten. The Austrians are the most common opponent to Napoleon, and they have gotten beaten, excuse me, about 4 different times. And every time they're learning and they're getting a little bit better. The unity of the Allies, we already talked about the political piece. This longest term battles to campaigns that wear the French out. Declining infantry. Hard to beat Napoleon of 1796 when you don't have cavalry and know where you are. One of the big things they can't, excuse me, one of the things they can't recover from is the lack of cavalry that they lose in the Russian campaign. It takes about 5 years to get a horse to be strong enough to be ridden as a cavalry mount. And so those horses destroyed in 1812 are not there for it. And the last thing is Napoleon's declining abilities or capabilities. If you look at paintings of him from, say, 1810, he still looks relatively healthy, not necessarily thin like he was in 1796, but not fat and like he is there in 1814. He's 44 years old. He's not that old at the time period, but between about 1812 and 1814, you see a physical going down. Some people speculate that he's going to die of stomach cancer in 1821, that possibly he's starting to feel the effects of stomach cancer. He does have hemorrhoids, which limits the amount of time he can spend on horseback, which is a really bad thing for a general because that's how you command your horses, your things. And so all these things are coming together. So let's talk a little bit about this, what you should take away from this. Napoleon, not an innovator. Okay, he systematizes and codifies. His strength is he takes these existing things from the revolution and makes it into systems that's able to react to his personal command. It's these pre-revolutionary reforms. The intellectual models that they use is there in the regiment, the 1791 regulations, and it's just putting it into effect once they have the revolution. Opponents start to copy what they can to make themselves more efficient. But as you can't copy all of them. Limitation of military revolutions. This is one of the pieces that we really spend a lot of time with our officers talking about. If the army that is the top paradigm army before a revolution, and a revolution comes, they normally are not the paradigm army anymore. They have no incentive to change. It's another army that is not the paradigm, who's going to pick up those pieces and learn and become that new paradigm army. So a lot of our officers will talk about, what's the new military revolution? It's an information. And I always have to tell them, I said, you better be very careful. One, you can't predict it, and you certainly can't control it. And if we're the paradigm army now, and this is really a military revolution going on, then we're probably not going to be the paradigm army afterwards. The other aspect of these military revolutions, they're finite in time that you have an advantage. Somebody gets this incredible performance boost, but everyone catches up. And so after, as it takes in this one, about a dozen years or so, all the other armies catch up. And so no longer do you see the French having such a definite advantage. Okay, I have time for some questions. I should leave you not with Napoleon on St. Helena looking back at his glory, but young Napoleon looking forward to his future from 1798 or so. Okay, so thank you.
I know you mentioned about the getting the nobility out of the officer corps, but looking at the Crimean War, the British still had that problem.
Yep.
And I think they learned from the Crimean War that same problem.
Yeah, the British Army, and it's the one I'm the most familiar with because that's where I do my research, is the most like what we call an ancien regime, prior to 1789 type of army, where it's political connections. The Duke of Wellington in the peninsula has a cavalry brigade commander, Major General Jack Slade, who's not a very good commander. He would love to get rid of him. However, Slade, when he was deploying, is met on the dockside by the Prince of Wales, who will be the new King George IV in a few years, and Slade doesn't have his sword, so the Prince of Wales takes his sword off and hands it to him. So that's how close Slade is to the regent, and so Wellington can't fire this guy. He has to wait for this guy to get recalled and put into another position. So those type of issues, particularly the British Army, plays a lot of a role. The Prussian Army, for example, though, of the, I think it's 186 officers are on active duty, 186 generals are on active duty in 1806 with a poor performance. They reform and they come back in 1813, and out of those 186 general officers who are on active duty, there's 3. The 183 were retired or moved out, retired because they were so old. And that's part of the reasons why the Prussians are able to have so much better of a performance.
I think that was also true in Crimea.
Oh,
Franklin was so old.
true, yeah.
Did Napoleon look for many innovations in weapons and equipment and things like that?
That's an interesting question. And when you say weapons, not really. I mean, the Charleville musket or the Brown Bess musket, which is a flintlock muzzle loading weapon, is virtually unchanged for about 150 years. The weapon his army is using in 1812 is the same weapon the French give us in 1777. is the same weapon that was being used in the 7 Years' War or the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s. So the weapons technology really hasn't kept up. There's minor improvements in the artillery and what they call the Gribovall system, where they standardize the artillery and make it a little bit lighter, but not a major advantage. What Napoleon does seek is he has yearly prizes for innovators. Canned foods, the putting something into boiling water into a can or a jar type of thing is a French invention during this time period. It's an award Napoleon gives out. He has a yearly award, how to preserve food, and someone comes up with that. So there's wagon load of canned food going into Russia in 1812. Getting rid of trying to innovate the silk industry in France so you can get rid of the cotton imports from England. So there are those aspects that he's trying to improve, but not really in weapons. It's kind of an interesting piece. It's not, we haven't gotten into the Industrial Revolution yet. It's just starting in England. So there's not really the ability to have the fine tuning, if you will. The weapons are still pretty much shop made individually. It's coming. He's coming with the thing here.
I'm pretty familiar with most of the Western Napoleonic battles, but regarding the Russian campaign, could you say something about why he chose to do that? I mean, from his perspective, it just seemed like a good idea at the time.
Well, the biggest thing I think about Napoleon in his foreign policy, one is the Russians are mobilized. The Russians have pulled out of the Treaty of Tilsit, where they have agreed to be part of the continental system. And Russian mobilization is starting in 1811. There's thought that the Russians are going to attack into the Duchy of Warsaw the year before. So you're Napoleon. You can wait in 1812 and wait for them to attack you because you're in a state of war now, or you can attack them. And of course, Napoleon, being this aggressive, having these revolutionary type of things, you don't wait. You don't wait for someone to attack you. You take the offensive and take it into their country. So it's not this I want to conquer the whole world type of thing. I mean, I think that's one of the big things it's oversold. There is this great power interaction where everybody is wanting to do things. I mean, one of the reasons why the Austrians don't join the coalition in 1813 initially, one is they're Napoleon's father-in-law. The second reason is they don't trust the Russians. They think the Russians are going to take a lot of Eastern Europe and stay there. And so they don't want to join the Russian side and help them to do that. And in the Congress of Vienna in 1814 going into 1815, when Napoleon comes in, it almost breaks up with a war at that time between the great powers, not between France. And so these great power rivalries, we kind of tend to forget those and kind of want to blame Napoleon on everything. So.
Hi. I read once that Napoleon had a great ability to read maps. I really didn't understand what I was reading. He didn't really go any further into detail. Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, part of it is, the question about his reading maps, it's not just his reading of maps. I mean, one of the things Napoleon does is he systemizes everything. For example, before he goes on a campaign, say, into Poland and Eastern Russia, he will create and have all these books made. He has these traveling libraries, and he'll have, he has a particular coach he has made that is his headquarters on the road, and he has a library set, and so every castle he has the exact same library, it has the exact same books in the exact same order. So whichever home he's in, he can go to that place and pick up the book he's at. He has a traveling set of library books, which he's had the books made so they have very, very little margins, so you can get thinner books, and really, really small print, so he can do that. So there's a lot of study beforehand. And one of the other things is he will take, and you'll see drawings of him, where he'll have the map out on the floor, he'll have calibers that are marked, they're put at the point with how far a corps can move in a day, and he'll be laying on the floor, measuring out how far his corps will go. All the corps move on separate routes, but they all are within 1 day's march of each other. So if one person makes contact, someone else can come and help. And the other part that we kind of overlook is his chief of staff, a guy named Alexander Berthier, who's supposedly the only man who can read his handwriting. Because what Napoleon will do is he will sit there and he will talk about what I want these different corps to do, and Berthier's taking notes, and then Berthier goes over to his portion of it, has all the secretaries, and he creates the actual orders that are read and implemented by the Grand Army. And there's lots of studies that talk about when an order comes in, how Napoleon gets it, when it leaves, how far it gets. But it's all part of a system. So it's not necessarily his ability to read a map. The other thing is he can look at, it's this QA, this French term for the look at the eye, that he can immediately look at a situation and understand what's going on and make the right decisions for that, where some of the other commanders need all this intelligence, they need all this confirming type of data, and he can look at a situation, understand exactly what's going on, and give those orders to have people start to move. And it's that ability to, we call it today an OODA loop, the ability to react quicker than your opponent and make decisions quicker and act, that constantly keeps them off of basis. So, someone over here, do you have a question?
Would you say fear was the key to his success, or was it respect that the men had, or a combination of those?
It's certainly not fear. It's certainly not fear. The men loved Napoleon. Napoleon has this ability. He has the ability to get this amazing devotion and loyalty out of his soldiers. You look at these images. The night before the Battle of Austerlitz, he sits out there on the battlefield on a hay straw in front of a guard fire. He eats what the soldiers do. He had the ability to, they will reward. He would go to a regiment and say, okay, tell me your 2 bravest soldiers. And he'll give them, say, Legions of Honor. And he'll come back years later and see some soldiers. How you doing? I remember I gave you that. And that ability to have the most powerful man in Europe, to remember your name, to remember the incident you did, those soldiers loved him. He leaves in April of 1814, goes off to Elba with 1,000 soldiers. I can't remember how many, 3 ships, 1,000 soldiers, can't remember how many cannons. He comes back a year later, basically in March of 1815, to start the 100 Days campaign. It's bloodlessly done. He starts marching on the French coast down near Caen and marches to Paris, and everybody who comes out to supposedly put him in a cage goes to his side. I mean, and he creates this army that's going to go to Waterloo that is one of the best armies he's had. It's an army of the 1805 campaign, because soldiers, one, they've seen what the Bourbons are like and everything, but they love the man. And so it's amazing charisma that he has. Now, he can be a jerk. I mean, it's certainly not to say that he's always just such a nice guy. They talk about some of the evenings, balls or something like that. He would, go up to a woman and say, "Madam, I hate that dress. Don't ever let me see you wearing it again." And just be absolutely frank and everything like that. So, but the charisma he had and to build the loyalty of the soldiers is really amazing. Oh no, not Tom. Don't give him the mic, because he's a Napoleonic person too. Okay.
You've described all of these changes in warfare that emerged in the French Revolution and under Napoleon's leadership, and how they proliferate through Europe over this 25-year period. The question is, in your opinion, what is the most important legacy of warfare in this period for warfare today?
For warfare today, that's an interesting question, because I can go so many different ways with that particular piece. It's interesting because I think the long-term effects of the Napoleonic Wars and the study really of maneuver and daring. The U.S. Army, when I was still on active duty, I went to Florida State University. I studied under Dr. Don Horward, one of the leading Napoleonic experts. But every single year, he would have 1 or 2 U.S. Army officers down there who, after we completed our master's, would go to West Point and teach for 3 years at West Point. So the U.S. Military Academy always had 1 or 2 Napoleonic people in there. It was that important to them in there. And of course, as we talked about with H-100, we still spend time on his campaigns, talking about why And so much of our focus in H100 is not on the military changes. It's looking at how society changes and how those society changes affect warfare. And it's for a very practical reason. We're looking at what society changes are going on now, how is that going to affect warfare in the future? All I can do is help the students kind of think about that in a historic context, so as they go out, they start to look on that. So all those pieces, I think, fit together. I mean, from just, if you want a concrete type of experience of what the legacy, I mean, the civil code that's still used in France and Louisiana, in most of Europe, is the Code Napoleon from 1803. The organization of France, the districts, all those pieces are Napoleonic. He starts the unification of Germany. He starts the unification of Italy. I could go on and on. That sounds like Bill's still in here? That'd be another good talk. Talk about what he does as a first consul for about a 2-year, 3-year period. But all those are, I think, are concrete type of things that we get out of this era. It's not just swords and bayonets, I guess. Any other questions? No? Robert?
What was Napoleon's evaluation of Suvorov? He seemed to be very successful.
Yeah, Suvorov really fights, I'm trying to remember, it's the 1800 Zurich campaign, Russian cult, the bayonet. I'm not sure if I know exactly when you say his evaluation. I think he respects him, but I don't know if he says, oh, he's a really good commander, I need to be particularly worried. I don't have that answer. Alexander Mrika-Brutza down at LSU, who writes on the Russian forces and campaign, would be the one to consult, who'd probably know. Come on, another question, because that wasn't a good one. I like to be able to answer a question. Okay, give me a softball now.
What did he think of Wellington?
He thinks he's overrated. Waterloo, the morning of Waterloo, where his officers are basically saying, it's the British Army, and Napoleon thinks, first off, he's Napoleon, and Wellington's overrated. He says just because he's beaten you doesn't make him a good general. It doesn't think very highly of either the British soldier or of Wellington himself. He's never faced him on the battlefield before Waterloo.
Well, just kind of a spin-off of both those two questions. Mm-hmm. Did any of his opposition generals reach the point that Napoleon actually respected them and thought, hey, this guy's, a real, because they always had the benefit of more resources, even though they were in sometimes clunky coalitions?
Yeah, I think he has grudging respect for Archduke Charles from Austria, who does a lot of the reforms of the Austrian army at Wagram in the 1809 campaign, Espern-Essling. Austrian forces do much, much better than they did before Kutuzov, Bagration. I mean, those Russian commanders, he certainly does not think the Russians are a pushover by any stretch of the imagination, and they are worthy opponents. I'm trying to think which other ones rise up to that level. I'm not getting anything. Part of the problem that some of those armies have is that they have the emperor or their monarch riding along with them. And I'm trying to remember which of the battles in 1813 where the nominal commander, the Russian Tsar, shows up and says, I'm taking command. And he basically goes to sleep under a tree because what else am I going to do? So those type of things hamper it. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you for coming out. I appreciate it.